a lot of the times I think we weaponize the word success to use against ourselves to almost abandon who we are and where we are. It's like, okay, success means making more money. Success means hitting a particular whatever in however many months. It means climbing up the ladder in some capacity. And the question I want to ask is, does that trajectory, does that vision of success feel like home to you? And if not, what are other parts of your life that does feel like home?
Hey, Nicole, what do you get when a former corporate CEO and a do-gooding executive walk into a recording studio?
Well, Aaron, nothing, because the two of us are usually on my couch or Zoom because wine.
You get a podcast created for Gen X women who are bought into the corporate world but fed up with the BS.
I know. It's how to thrive the 9 to 5 or 6 or 7.
It's career therapy. It's comedy. It's definitely full-on authenticity. Basically, we give you tangible strategies to rise in your career without compromising everything else.
Because work doesn't have to suck.
Hey guys, it's Erin, and I'm here to introduce another podcast episode. And it's so funny here. Let me read the bio that Angela sent over, and then I will give a little bit of context to the interview. It says, Angela is a sovereignty practitioner. She works with people who want to trust themselves above everything else. That's it. This is one of the most intriguing, interesting, introspective interviews I think I've done in a long time. Angela, she's a lawyer and a coach, and she also had a podcast called The Anger Podcast for some time, and now it's called the Sovereign Professionals Podcast. And you know what? Knowing Angela, it could be called something different in 4 days from now. She is, as I call her, as opinionated person I've ever met. And we dive into things like anger and how to deal with it. We talk about this concept of sovereignty and how you really need to honor it and respect it so that you can make decisions on your own. We talk about parenting. And I think if you are somebody that's always felt a little bit different, a little bit odd, a little bit of a don't put me in a corner, don't put baby in a corner. I think this episode you'll really relate with, and I really enjoyed it. It was, like I said, one of the more different interviews I've done, but one that really packs a lot of power in just a little bit of time. So, without further ado, here's my interview with Angela Hahn.
I've been listening to your podcasts and interviews, and you fascinate me. This podcast is all about authenticity. I think somebody could say you're definitely authentic, although I know you don't like labels. But I want to start first with, you sort of said you've made a lot of your decisions in life sort of through the lens of anger, like we've been driven by anger. Maybe tell us a little bit about your background and what you mean by that.
Yeah. So I think the first decision that I remember that I made out of anger is when I decided to go, oh my gosh. Oh no. Yeah. Actually, yeah. When I decided to go to college, I was trying to decide between NYU and BU, and BU gave me like some sort of like scholarship of some sort. And I had the choice to go to BU or NYU. And in Korea, at the time, and this was a long time ago, like, I don't know, 15 years ago-ish. And I think it still is right now, but at the time also, like, NYU was like, quote unquote, ranked higher and had more reputation, or like a higher reputation or whatever. And so people were kind of, nudging me to just go to NYU. And I think I got really angry about that. As my current mentor, one of my current mentors, David Bedrick, says, like, you tie her up and she'll find her weapons. So like when I feel restricted, I feel that the more urgent need to like express myself. And so I was just angry about the fact that my life was being dictated by other people's sense of reputation. And so I decided to go to BU. And then I caved after a year. I was like, okay, maybe this reputation thing matters. And so I just fucking went to US News and then was like, oh, well, Northwestern is ranked higher, so I should probably transfer there. And so that was my very first one. And then I got angry about how I couldn't fix my parents' marriage. And so I went to law school to try to fix that with the brain that I had at the time. And then I decided to start a business because I was angry about the fact that my law school classmates were getting like these high paying law firm jobs and I was getting rejected by all of them.
Mm.
And so those were kind of some of the main decisions that I made out of anger.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And you talk a lot about anger. Your podcast was originally called the Anger Podcast, although you've changed that and we'll talk about it in a little bit. But it was one of the reasons it attracted to me because it's a topic that we don't talk much about, and our audience is mostly corporate working folks. So you can imagine there's a few angry people about a few things. But you talk openly and you sort of name an anger. What is it about, the topic of anger that made you originally do a podcast on it? You talk about it, you're so open. Like, what is it about that word, that emotion that I guess makes you passionate or angry or both?
Yeah. So I actually had a podcast called Fit to Practice. It was like for lawyers for like 3.5 years or so.
Mm.
And then I switched it to the Anger Podcast because several reasons. I think, again, like every time I find myself being tied up in any like capacity, like being resisted in any capacity, I feel the need to like break that chain or break that rope or whatever that is tying me up. And so I noticed that about myself, like, oh, like literally all of my decisions are being driven by anger. So I don't know why everybody thinks that anger is such a terrible thing. Even if it's like quote unquote bad decision, it's always giving me some sort of information about what I care about. And so I want to talk about this. I want to have some space for this. And that's why I gave it some space for a couple months.
Yeah. And you talk about like the myths of anger. So like our listeners are probably going, okay, yes, I am freaking angry, but most of the time, right, the self-help books sort of help us, tell us how to prevent it, how to get rid of it quickly. Like, what is it that you see differently about anger that made you, spend some time there?
Yeah, I think all of that narrative is just part of the sort of colonizing narrative, colonizing programming around, especially for women, to kind of just remain small and calm and not angry. Like angry is an emotion only reserved for men. And men, like just referring to a binary world that was more prevalent in the past. So men had more right to more things, including the right to be angry. And so it was because they sort of held that superiority and that colonizing mentality, they felt the need to sort of really just perpetuate this narrative that anyone who does not identify as a man has less of a right to be angry. And so I think when you talk about like the self-help books, I think that really just speaks to the internalized programming of silencing women and how that is the quote unquote right thing to do.
If you gave our listeners just one tip that maybe they've never heard that you think would help them as they sit there and say, yeah, I'm angry up and down, right? I am angry. I've got crappy leadership. I've got too much work. I've got a crappy coworker. What's one tip that you'd give them that maybe they've never tried before, they haven't thought of, that might help them through that?
I think that's like the first thing I would point out is that like the need to have some sort of tip, the need to have some sort of outside strategy or information on how you navigate through anger, as if there is like one good way to experience your anger. And that sort of, I think, stems from this idea of it overlaps a lot with the concept of perfectionism, where you have to experience things in a certain way. But I would say the question that I want to ask is like, if there was no right or wrong way to experience your anger, what would it be? And really honor the shit out of that.
Yeah. And that sort of brings up sort of where your anger or your passion has taken you next, and your podcast is now called the Sovereign Professionals Podcast. Not a word that us,
non-lawyers or non-big word people use very often. What does that mean to you, and why is it so important?
Yeah, so I really did debate because the one of the last things I wanted to do was like use words that would make people feel alienated or isolated, or otherwise like feel like they don't belong. But it was really the only word that I could find, and truth be told, I feel like a lot of words are failing me these days because this feels like I'm also one of those people that don't feel like I belong because, and one of the reasons that there's just not words that are sufficient or adequate to really describe what I am trying to convey. But when I found the word sovereignty, which is through one of my coaches, Simone Sol, a while back, she sort of described it as a sense of like trying to really having your own agency on doing things. And the way I describe it is like really going back to the traditional definition of sovereignty, like when you think about sovereign lands, right? The fact that, I don't know, I'm just going to name two countries, the US and Zimbabwe, right? Like you cannot try somebody in a US court according to the laws of Zimbabwe, right? That doesn't that's just a non sequitur. But a lot of the times we find ourselves doing that. We find ourselves passing judgment, being the judge, jury, and executioner of all of our decisions, thoughts, and actions in some capacity based on somebody else's rules that are not you. And so my sort of message, the word that I want to spread is, what are your rules? What are your laws according to your own sovereignty that you want to measure against, not anybody else's?
Yeah, that is there a word in Korean that is better? Is that easier?
No, that's the thing. Like, that's why I said like words fail me instead of English words fail me, because like any word in any language that I know of fail me. So I'm always like on a word scavenger hunt in whatever language that I have the capacity for to adequately describe what I'm experiencing.
Yeah. So obviously, we're a podcast about authenticity. Love the concept of sort of writing your own rules. This is like almost an extreme to that. Where do people start to say, okay, I'm going to start writing my own rules, but I'm going to do it in a way that also is going to make sure I have success. That I'm going to keep my job or grow my business. Like, tell us more about how that can be more than just a feel good, I guess.
Yeah. So one of the things that I also talk about is like is sort of boycotting that word success as well. Because when you think about the word success, I ask people like, what does like when you think about the person who has success, quote unquote success, what do they look like? And what is their skin color? What does their hair look like? How long is their hair? What are they wearing? And do all of these things look like you? And a lot of the times the person that we envision having success doesn't really look like us. And so the question is like, okay, that's the first question of sovereignty, right? Whose word is success? And is that even your word? And maybe there are other words, like alchemical, there are words like shiny, there are words like, I don't know, outrageous. Maybe those are the words that you resonate with a little bit more. Or maybe it's not even a word, maybe it's just a bodily experience that feels like home to you. And so it's more about like a lot of the times I think we weaponize the word success to use against ourselves to almost abandon who we are and where we are. It's like, okay, success means making more money. Success means hitting a particular whatever in however many months. It means climbing up the ladder in some capacity. And the question I want to ask is, does that trajectory, does that vision of success feel like home to you? And if not, what are other parts of your life that does feel like home? And what about it feels like home to you? And how do you want to expand on that for other scenarios in your life?
Yeah. And I love that, that home, that word home, right? It's a great, back to, finding the right words. I think you are finding great words. So many people say, what is the definition to you about like, what is home to you? What feels good? And then how do you build
probably more of that. So I know you're a coach, and this concept of sovereign, you sort of take to extreme. I think, coaching is about asking a lot of questions, helping people find their own way. And there's different people. There's a scale in how people do that. But from what I've read and what you talk about, it sounds like you're sort of really owning in on this. So how does that look? How does that feel? What are some of the questions, maybe a tidbit for our listeners that you do that maybe unlock people to find their own answers, their own home, better than they can do, without that coaching?
Yeah. So I think everything that I do is like sort of paradoxical and oxymoronic, like, and inconsistent in a lot of ways. And part of that is like, I know you're hiring me to support you in your journey. And at the same time, one of the things that I really encourage you to do and invite you to do is also relinquish the need for me to tell you anything or to even guide you or advise you in capacity. And none of my opinions matter. And so just having somebody present with you to witness your own agency and witness you being able to disappoint me, being able to tell me no, and being able to fully hold space for your rejection of me and everything that I am about. I think that is almost one of the first steps that we take so that your sovereignty is witnessed. Because a lot of the times when the parts of you that are witnessed are the parts of you that you almost feel the permission to amplify.
Yeah. I think that's hard for a lot of people, especially, a lot of our listeners being in corporate America. That concept, right? It's more, they live in a world of answers and mentors and guidance and playbooks. And when was the time when this really clicked for you? You maybe even sitting on the other side. I know you mentioned you have coaches, you're a lawyer, which is not your standard woo-woo, lots of time to, self-reflect, more time to read and argue and shuffle papers back and forth. Was there a time when you sort of had an aha that it sort of really changed you, that made you want to do this more for others?
I think I don't have like one big aha moment, but I always have like a constant sort of like of different scales of sort of, I don't know, this is very a coachy word, like breakthrough of like, oh, hold on a second, that's not me. Or, oh, like, hold on a second, I don't know when that was part of my story. I think it's time to sort of like unsubscribe from that. And so it's kind of more about noticing and practicing. That's why that's why I call myself more of a practitioner rather than a coach, because I'm constantly practicing that myself. But one thing that has become clear to me is that again, like I feel like the work that I do is so urgent, in terms of becoming more aware of what I really care about and becoming aware of how much harm that I'm causing, becoming aware of how much power that I do have and how much value that I do bring. Like every facet of me is so important for me to be aware of, because going back to anger and trauma, like I feel like I've been traumatized so many times being around people who had absolutely no awareness of how much harm they were causing and how valuable they were, and not being able to accurately assess who they really are, and me kind of buying into that and that affecting my sense of self. For example, like when I hired business coaches a while back of like, yeah, the best way to be successful is to make more money very quickly and all those things. And in the process of subscribing to that and their unawareness of building a business on their own terms and how much powerful that is, because I subscribed to what they were saying, I actively was abandoning myself and how I was capable simply based on my own knowing and my own information and who I was to build a sustainable business. And so because I have interacted with so many people whose unawareness affected me, I'm like in such an urgent need to constantly be more aware of who I really, really am.
Nicole, what are you doing over there? I'm finally getting up off the virtual couch and making some career moves, just like you told me. And I came across your authenticity playbook.
Yeah. I forgot to tell you about it. This authenticity playbook I've had for a long time, and it's actually the most downloaded resource I have. It's basically 10 quote unquote plays, authenticity plays that you can make at work to stand out and get promoted and use authenticity as your strategy, your secret weapon.
I'm really going to take this to heart because despite all the sports references, I know that it's full of your awesome and your authenticity. And it probably is going to help me go far or go home or go big or whatever the sports reference is.
All the things. So listeners, if you also want the authenticity playbook, you can go to beauthentic.com/playbook and you can make career moves like Nicole.
Whoop, whoop, Heisman!
I'm sitting here thinking about, so I'm writing my second book, which is called The 50% Rule. And that concept is when you learn from others, mentor, online course, class, podcast, only take about 50%. And then the other 50% sort of curate it. So it's your own, based on your own ideas, different things you've heard, et cetera. What I'm hearing you say is almost to the extreme. I'm curious what your take is on the concept of 50% rule, or if you're like, no, don't listen to anything, all go within yourself. Like, how do you reconcile that? And do you miss out potentially on some of the good, like lessons people learned, walls they've run into that would be nice to not bump your head against, et cetera?
Yeah, I think there is a reason that you and I are different. There's a reason that people show up very differently, whether it's in relationships or businesses or careers or activism or whatever. We all show up differently for good reason. The way you talk about and the way you frame, like you said, the 50% rule is helpful to the people that you're speaking to. And who am I to say like, oh, actually, you need to listen completely to yourself. You need to implement the 0% rule. You don't listen to anybody, because everybody is in different dimensions. Everybody is in a different terrain at different times, and so really, whatever feels like home to them. And some people find the 50% rule home. Like, oh wow, like I thought I needed to be at 100%. I need to listen to everybody 100%, but I feel like I have permission to go to 50-50 where I have a say in what I really want to do. And maybe to those people, what I'm saying might feel like, oh my gosh, like it's so jarring. I don't know what to do about that. And so it's like, that's why it's so valuable that we have different words. We have different ways of communicating and different terms and feelings and thoughts that we hold in the space that we create. And so really the bottom line is like, who the fuck am I to say anything about that?
Yeah. Angela, you're the most opinionated person I've ever met. I think you said it at the beginning, right? You're like, I'm juxtaposed, I'm oxymoronic, like you're obviously self-aware. But I just love how you answered that. You're sort of like, on one hand, you're so strongly opinionated, right? And not afraid to speak up, but in the other, you're like, you could just hear like so much compassion, right? In your response, you're not being wafy, you're not being easy, you're just like, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, Erin. Like that's actually my whole premise, which is that, maybe some people just, shouldn't have the answer to things. So, if anger, drove a lot of your decisions, which obviously propelled you to do great things, successful career, start a business, et cetera. Do you ever worry that you have to have sort of that anger? Like, do you think that, is the motivation that's always going to be for Angela? Or do you think, oh, maybe someday it'll be more the antithesis, the passion, the whatever?
Yeah. So I think what I prioritize first and foremost is whatever emotion or thought that is true at the moment. And be at those pivotal moments, it just happened to be that anger was the truest emotion. And so there are a lot of other decisions that I make where anger is absent, and I honor that as equally as the other instances where anger is at the top.
Well, that would talk about you're also a parent. I know you told a story about, sort of being self-aware of your concerns about your daughter and maybe teaching her too many manners and sort of almost your own comfort or ego or whatever it was getting in the way sometimes. And how do you reconcile it? I mean, a lot of our listeners are parents, and how do you think about parenting through this lens of a sovereign sort of lifestyle, if you will?
Yeah. So I think that um, when it comes to parenting, one thing that is clear to me is that I'm not interested in being any particular type of parent. And I'm not interested particularly in being a good parent, because I think that the word good has been defined primarily by people who have had some sort of disproportionate power um, uh, in in the world, where like the word good has been used to, like, it has been really weaponized against people who are different from, like, who have been colonized, right? And so a lot of times when people tell me, oh, well, you're a good parent, like you're doing really well, I feel two things. Number one is that you have no idea what I am, like who I am and how I am in front of the kids and with my kids. And number two, you are not the arbiter of good and bad, and you do not get to pass any sort of judgment on who I am as a parent. And so what that does for me is that kind of frees up some space for me to determine exactly what kind of parent I am and how I want to move. And it really allows me to focus on my relationship with my kids all by myself. And something that I realize, like, why that is so important is, like, when I go to these like events where like there are other parents and other kids, and there's like, camp sometimes, right? And then we're like, it's very natural for us to sort of judge each other and for us to like, oh my gosh, like my kid is like smarter, or like my kid is more calmer, my kid is more obedient than that kid over there or whatever. And when one of the events that we went to, we were supposed to follow instructions, and my kid was not following instructions. She was just like running around and like just being herself or whatever, and just exploring things and sort of causing a problem to the instructor. And I noticed in myself my desire to get her to come here to me and sit down. And the reason I had that desire is because I was afraid of judgment.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want other parents to think that I am a terrible parent. And as soon as I was able to notice that, and also witness myself not having the need for their approval, I was able to ask the question of like, okay, what do I really want? What do I really want? Instead of what does everybody else want for me and my child? And so I was able to sort of let go, I guess, in so many words, of just whatever she was doing. And so, like, of course, there are times when I tell her to calm down or listen or be kind for my own benefit. But also there are times when I'm able to sort of witness that, notice that about myself, and able to kind of like hold that space for her to just be and cause problems and just express herself on her own terms, even if a lot of other people might feel like it's inappropriate.
Yeah, I think what you talk about there is, I can't underscore it enough. In sports, kids' sports, and the academics, and the running around at the playground, I think it's really powerful for our listeners to sort of really soak in that, and for me to soak in that, right? And say, when you're feeling anxious or you're yelling at your kid or you're guiding your children, to ask yourself kind of why, like what is driving that? And if it's simply your own ego or fear of what people think or whatever you want to call it, but it's sort of a much more selfish versus, no, this, obviously this kid shouldn't be hitting the other kid with a stick. Like that's different if you're like worried about the harm of a child, the other child.
And I think that's where that's a slope that most parents slide down on the regular,
Yeah.
especially, I've very active sports kids and, on this and on the field, that's, in fact, my son played a baseball game yesterday and it was an intertown. There's two different teams within the league. And it was the third game and one team had won one and one had the other. And it's very recreational. My son's never played baseball before. He's 12 years old and he's picking it up for the first time, and there are other kids as well. So it's pretty laid back compared to like hockey, soccer, and other things he plays. But it went to the last inning. It was tied, and at some point I looked at one of the other moms and I said, this is really a coaches versus coaches game, right? Because you could see, the kids, for the most part, right? It's baseball. They're pretty laid back. Like, what are you going to do? Most of the time you're standing around doing nothing. But the coaches were so into it. And I'm like, no, this game, which we lost, by the way, we lost by two runs, but really turned into that. And so I think, Angela, I think that's a really important point. If nothing else you get from this podcast, just like pause and ask yourself. And
that are supposed to be okay is not okay. And so it's hard. It sometimes it takes a minute for your body to process, but I invite you to consider what are the parts of you that are not just okay, but are absolutely necessary for the world that is continuing to evolve in front of us.
I love it. Thank you, Angela. Han, it was so nice to have you on and to be spinning in your crazy universe. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Friends, do you have other friends? Are they adults? Are they out in the world somewhere? Please, please, please invite them to listen to our podcast.
Okay, dude, you sound like a late night, like 2 a.m. infomercial. Basically, what she's saying is our love language is ratings, reviews, and sharing the podcast. We'd love nothing more. And if you would do that.